So, to our first session with Bishop Rowan Williams, and his subject is Glyn Simon, Bishop and Archbishop, his life and his contribution to the Diocese of Llandaff and Wales. This session will discuss Glyn Simon, his influence on the life of the Church in Wales during and after the Second World War, concentrating particularly on his influence in three areas: the relationship between the Church and the world of arts, the relationship between the Church and the political life, particularly the national movement, and also developments in spirituality and liturgy. Glyn Simon appears as a figure who created the new concept of identity in the Church in Wales. Our speaker, Rowan Williams, was born in Swansea and studied theology at Cambridge. Following his research in Oxford, he worked in pastoral and academic posts in England before returning to Wales as Bishop of Monmouth from 1992 until 2002. He was Archbishop of Wales from 1999 to 2002, and then Archbishop of Canterbury from 2002 to 2012. Following some years in Cambridge, he retired and returned to Cardiff in 2020, where he continues very active, teaching and writing. Felly, welcome, Bishop Rowan. Thank you very much, Dyfrig. And thank you for the invitation to speak about Glyn Simon. Glyn Simon was a very important influence on me personally, and it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about him. In his famous work, The Span of the Cross, Christian Religion and Society in Wales, Denzil Morgan described Glyn Simon as the Archbishop who's at the most honoured in the history of the Church in Wales. And this is still a valid criticism, I think. The work of Archbishop Simon demonstrates as an example of creative commitment to the social problems in Wales and indeed in the whole world. Simon not only was a supporter of industrial chaplaincy in the Diocese of Llanfair, particularly in Port Talbot, and the promoter of the need for better housing, but he also supported C&D and was a violent opponent of apartheid in South Africa. He raised questions about industrial training, the persecution of the church in Russia, civic development, and other matters. And in the later period, he became more sympathetic to the national movement in Wales. He visited David Iwan in prison during the debate about the official status of the Welsh language. Nothing of this was expected on following. If you look at Glyn Simon's early career, he was born in Swansea, educated in Christ College, Brecon, and Jesus College. He went to St Stephen's House in a bastion of traditional Anglo-Catholic teaching, St Stephen's House. He served as curate in Crewe before returning to Wales as warden of the church hostel in Bangor. From his background and education, he took a sense of suspicion towards the nonconformist tradition in Wales, and his early ministry didn't show much signs of radicalism in church matters or even political matters. But this development quickly after his marriage to Sheila Roberts in 1941. a lady of a Baptist background and a Welsh speaker. She also was very sympathetic to a variety of progressive movements, feminism even. Without a doubt, her influence on Simon was very important. But that's not the whole story. This is a summary by Moelwyn Merchant, poet, sculptor, poet, and a noted scholar on the situation of the church in Wales during the 40s and 50s. Lively times in the church in Wales. He wrote, and this is in English, all Welsh speakers, by the way.
A very vigorous group of young clerics were determined to establish a thoroughly Welsh and Catholic Anglicanism in a tradition which we knew united us with the rich literary, artistic, and liturgical tradition of medieval Wales.
During and after the war, the church in Wales took a sort of part in a new trust in the church, as in England. This was the generation of Dorothy Sayers, T.S. Eliot, and many others of the literary world. John Piper became. It was a generation which discovered the Catholic tradition. In the Catholic tradition, a rich resources which can reflect the depths of human experience. Glyn Simon's imagination grew over the years to embrace a new understanding about contemporary social issues. This went hand in hand with discovery of the potential of the arts to expand the church's witness, particularly during his time as a dean in Llandor Cathedral. Simon became more prominent as a patron of the arts and a bit of a director in the field of ecclesiology. In 1956, he became president of the Ecclesiological Society and reforming the cathedral was one of the significant achievements. The redesigning of St. Michael's, the changing of liturgy, as the research of Dr. Julie Roach has shown, and introduced the church in Wales as a friend of the creative life. It's possible to compare Glyn Simon, therefore, with somebody like George Bellow in Wales, Dean of Canterbury and then Bishop of Chichester. Glyn Simon, like himself, at the same time was a patron of all sorts of the arts and promoter of various causes. Also promoting the cause of those who had suffered, the Jews in Germany and those who suffered carpet bombing. This, perhaps, was the central mission of Glyn Simon. As dean, archbishop and a bishop, had a commitment to the Catholic tradition, which makes more clearly with the Anglican vision as a serious partner in the cultural life of Wales and the world. Denzil Morgan wrote that nonconformity in the earlier period had retained its links with academia, and the academic word appeared a bit slightly parochial, but this was less true of the church. The group described earlier, Moelwyn Merchant, William Williams, and James Islown Davies, together with Glyn Simon himself, and also perhaps Aneurin Talbot Davies, a Anglican layperson, literary critic, a journalist who had an interest in theology, and there was an interest in political issues and also George Brees and European movements. and in time became closer to the concerns for social justice and national questions in Wales. And although the majority of the group were Welsh speakers, the bishop himself was never totally fluent in Welsh, but his support for the language was emotional. And this created one of the most bitter arguments, as in his time as Bishop of he challenged the election of John Thomas and Edwin Morris as bishop in 1957 on the basis of his inability to speak Welsh. I believe that much more research remains to be done about this group, not only Archbishop Simon, but also the influence of Aneurin Talfon, friend of Dylan Thomas and David Jones, and an amateur theologian of great perception, a sharp commentator on ecclesiastical church, and also biography, including Moelwyn Merchant, for example. And the background of the vision of figures like these to the thinking of Bishop Timothy Rees is a fruitful field for research. Timothy Rees established a basic basis for the thinking of Merchant, Williams, and so on. And Glyn Simon was an important figure in this. Timothy Rees began to turn the church in Wales in the 30s towards a vision of the industrial workers of South Wales, on the first time on the level of the bench of bishops. He was an heir of the Christian community of the Resurrection in Mirfield, for instance. At the same time, he inherited a theological theory of this can be seen in his hymns, such as God is Love. And one thing which is very important in this regard is something that Simon has stated from time to time, his agreement with Rees in this matter. Rees and Simon had some sympathy with liberal theology, which seemed to weaken the classical theories. I remember Simon chatting in 1970, or it might have been 71, saying that he was red in politics and blue in theology. To Simon, that sort of revisionism didn't do justice to the Christian vision of radicalism and the unity of God and man on the cross. He didn't have much time for the theories of John Robinson, honest to God, although Robinson wrote a chapter in a book edited by Simon in 1961 about the theology of being a bishop. It's worth noting how Simon worked about during his time in Llandaff about the ministry of bishops. In 1970, he recommended to the governing body of creating a college of bishops, sharing an idea which he drew and developed from John Robinson's essay himself. In other words, his fidelity to the tradition wasn't a matter of conservatism. As other members of the group, particularly Edward Lewis, he was enthusiastic for the renewal and of the liturgy. He'd been chair of the first of the chair of the Liturgical Commission of the Church in Wales in the 50s. And it may be said, although despite his suspicion towards some aspects of Roman Catholicism, he shared a lot of many of the views of. He wasn't simply a Vatican II Catholic, but he was much in sympathy with many trends in Europe. The new 1966 was an evidence of the way he wanted the church worship to go. Decades of prayer book Catholicism, the more classical form of worship, but with something a bit stronger, beginning perhaps, and showed the influence of St. Stephen's House on him. But turning back to questions about theology and social witness, something must be said about an event which brought Glyn Simon to the public notice. That is the Aberfan tragedy in 1966. This, I think, as many, was the most significant hour in Simon's relationship with the people of Wales. Response to the news would be robust. Firstly, he wrote a letter to the Western Mails, not only about the shock of but also emphasised the need to tackle the danger of old industrial sites in Wales. In later comments, Simon still emphasised on the neglect on the part of government and the industrial leaders, neglect which created such awful dangers. So Simon demonstrated as a defender of the ordinary people of Wales, the people of the valleys particularly. He spoke during a visit about his feelings about the miners.
I feel angry, as I often feel where the miners are concerned, because this is part of the terrible price that is quite happily and unconsciously accepted by the community. It's nonsense to say that money isn't available, but it's got to be available on a big scale that only government can find.
Powerful words which confirm his concern, emphasize his concern for the communities. But even more important, perhaps, was an address which he made on the BBC on the 23rd of October, 2 days after the tragedy. As in the visit, he mentioned losing his wife and his first child.
If I had not known for myself sorrow over the death of someone I loved and love still, I would not have dared to speak tonight.
In the radio interview, he mentioned a commonwealth of suffering, and the same here. When I try to explain the problem of evil, but a community of loss and mourning, it is very similar. It was very like Simon not to speak in cliches. And we can hear an echo again of Timothy Rees and his work about the human sadness in his context of God is love. If I may venture a personal memory, this address was one of the things which confirmed my faith and strengthened my calling. I can't recall any other interview which made such an impression with any suggestion of artificial godliness or easy answers. As a preacher, in various contexts, university, an address to an international meeting, a lecturer to antiquarian societies, and many other situations, he was never conventional. Once again, no cliches. He always spoke clearly and strongly, and also quite wittily. And this last explained why he was not always popular with everybody, particularly during his early career. He was never scared about opposition. And he got his share of this, particularly for his political interventions. I don't think he went out to seek debate or controversy, but he didn't want to remain silent in the face of injustice and also in the face of folly, such as his battle in the 50s with the Archdruid Cynan, which he emphasized the modern basis of the orsedd, and indeed was quite satirical about them. In his later years, he moderated himself a bit, but he didn't lose his sharp analysis. He spoke as one with authority. Authority of a healthy culture, which is recognized by the academic work as well as the artistic world, the authority of personal experience and spiritual feeling. And if his authority had been recognized by scholars, he could speak more directly to students. Was his bravery and an awareness of the spiritual roots of his mission. Simon was never a powerful orator, but the contents of his addresses was always clear, full of challenge, spirituality, and memorable. Once again, I'll mention a personal memory of a message to the RSCM in Brecon Cathedral in 1967, and spoke to the diocese, a sermon full of freshness from Psalm 87. The singers and dancers would say, "All my conception is of you." I believe that the words of this sermon still stand. How do we weigh St. Glyn Simon's contribution to the ethos of the Church in Wales? On one aspect, he hasn't made vast differences to the structure of the province. He was not a fan of the governing body. And one thing that must be said, he wasn't very enthusiastic about ecumenical ventures. He was happy to cooperate with other churches in some contexts, such as the industrial chaplaincy, although he was critical of the commitment with the non-conformist bodies. But he didn't show a lot of interest in, for instance, shared ministry on a parish level. This before the last days of his ministry, when he supported sharing communion in limited circumstances. He was open the steps towards unity with the Methodists, and this is in contrast with his successor William Williams, who moved more forward with these, and he shared the spiritual and ministerial experiences. I'm certain that Archbishop Barry will mention something of this in the second talk. Perhaps the Simon's mission as a bishop and archbishop was the renewal of liturgy in the 60s. But from another standpoint, his contribution was very significant, even transformational. Think of his support to the language movement, the relationship between the Anglican Church and the Welsh-speaking community after a difficult period, and indeed bitter. Remember the election of John Thomas and Edwin Morris. Of course, he hadn't changed the whole landscape. Tensions continued in the province over the following decades, and we know. But Simon succeeded to change the expectations in the church and in the Welsh-speaking community. Taking Welsh as a matter of a serious matter became important, especially on an official and public level in Wales. and the Bishop of Simon with David Iwan in prison was more effective in influencing the behavior of many official institutions. I see the same effect in relations between the church and the political world, the industrial world of South Wales. The contribution of David Lee about his contribution to the industrial mission is not accidental. We're not talking about structural changes about industrial chaplaincy, but it's not a gesture which links with the whole community, a change of expectations. Glyn Simon made the church in Wales a credible partnership with different institutions of different colours in his time as Llandaff and as Archbishop. He showed a feeling in this, particularly in his various addresses about the architecture and planning of churches. It's worth noting that he'd spoken very sympathetically about the architecture of the chapels of Wales, despite his attitude towards current nonconformity. He was careful in his relations with the Roman Catholic Church, not hostile, but I think he'd absorbed enough Anglo-Catholic theory, didn't think of the church as an alien, as previous nonconformists felt, as many figures. He found similar paths with the Catholic Church in Europe, with Barth and Catholics in Wales, and the whole United Kingdom. This wasn't unusual. Before the changes of the Second Vatican Council had been more widely accepted. It was a bit of a paradox, in fact, but Simon was close to Archbishop Morris in his commitment to the Anglican Church as the old church of the country, and as Morris and Simon thought it. Although Simon was much more in a dreamy attitude as to how this would work. The name of Glyn Simon was the first Archbishop of Wales who would become truly a national figure. And he could speak for the whole community. And this is Owen Jones and Aneurin Talfon's opinion. For many of his contemporaries, Glyn Simon, at least as Archbishop, could contribute as the voice of the whole of Wales. This isn't to deny that there were problems. As Denzil Morgan has noted, almost also theological dialogue initiated by with Glyn Simon and the leading figures of non-conforming thought, Bobby Jones, Tudur Jones, and so on. The world of Glyn Simon continued. It was the world of the South Wales, the valleys, and the capital. But by recognizing this, it's still true that Glyn Simon became an iconic figure for many people in the province, particularly young people in the churches, younger clerics and students. He knew that Archbishop Glyn gave to the church in Wales a new vision of the commitment to the modern world in all its complexity, not forgetting the traditions, the liturgical, Catholic and spiritual traditions. Our debt is still great to my generation, but also on behalf of the whole church and all who hope to see the future of the church, being totally aware of his inner depth, which called him to transform human society. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, Rowan, for raising the revealing some of the work of contribution of Glyn Simon to the life of the church and also the life of Wales. We have about a couple of minutes to ask questions. I don't know whether anyone has a question. There will be opportunities later on after the second. But does anybody have any question now? This is your opportunity. I see Ainsley's hand is up. Ainsley. I don't know if you want to go first. No, you go first. First of all, thank you, Bishop Rowan, for such a lively portrayal of Archbishop. I just have a comment more than a question. The idea that his Catholicism was wide-ranging, really, and inclusive, not looking inward toward the church, toward the liturgy and its internal life, although his contribution there was great, but also looking out to the world, socially, in a period of emergency such as Aberfan, but also looking back historically to the roots of the church and the age of the saints and the rich life of the medieval church, that he encompassed all these elements and kept the church from becoming too parochial and too narrow. I wonder whether it's possible to grasp that again in the crises that we face today, with the effect of secularism and all sorts of other complex social questions. So thank you very much. Thank you, Ainsley. Yes, it's a very important subject. And trying to find answers. You need the resources. And you need the roots, I think. You need deep roots.
Resourceful.
And I see Glyn Simon's journey as a journey to the depths of this idea and a journey towards a vision which includes all the repertoire of the tradition to provide answers which are in sympathy with the current present situation. And I think the word Catholic is truly appropriate in this context. Thank you. The only comment I had was about his relationship with art, the arts. I think with the arts within the church. Is that something that the church in Wales has lost, you think, over the decades? And because of that, we are perhaps poorer as a church because we don't engage as much with the arts. Indeed. I think that the church has lost something. I think the period after the Second World War was special. But what Glyn Simon has done was create a possibility for the church to appear as a friend to those practicing the arts. It was an opening, I think. And I think, yes, we have lost something in Our vision, perhaps?
Well, physical.
With perhaps the physical aspect of the church. There's a problem there for the whole church. But not just the church in Wales. We have an opportunity to have a short break for you to stretch your legs, go and fetch a cup of tea or something. May I ask you to return, to be back to your screens by 11:15, please? And the second session will begin promptly at 11:15. So we move on to the second presentation this morning with Bishop Barry. And the presentation will be about Gio Williams, Bishop and Archbishop, and Barry will be discussing his life and contribution to the Diocese of Bangor and the Province of Wales. Barry Morgan was Archbishop of Wales from 2003 to 2017. He served his whole ministry in the church in Wales as a parish priest, lecturer, chaplain, and archdeacon. He was ordained in 1972 and was elected Bishop of Bangor in 1993. He became Bishop of Llandaff and Archbishop in 1999. So a very warm welcome, Barry. Thank you very much, Dyfrig. It's a pleasure to be here. One person suggested to me that we should have a title from Vauxhall Allegro, because what the former bishop told me, I arrived in the diocese in the Daimler, and here I'm leaving in an Allegro. And this says about much about the bishops of Wales in 1957 and 1982. It is obvious that there was nothing wrong in the 50s with arriving in Daimlers in their diocese. Not that the current bishops can do that. And he bought the Daimler from Llandovery for £650 in 1957. Well, that was a tremendous sum, of course. 15 years later, in 1972, that was my year's salary as a curate. I don't know how much curate earned in 1957. Reminds me about a book about J.C. Jones, Gio's predecessor as Bishop of Bangor. J.T. Jones constantly caught the train from Bangor Station to go to Cardiff. People working on the railway would lift their caps to him, saying, "Good morning, Lord Bishop." And says the author about J.C. Jones. The Archbishop Green, also former Bishop of Bangor, would never allow people to be so bold with him. I became to know Gio in 1975 when I was editor of the Welsh Churchman. I'm sorry to say that nobody saw anything wrong with the title at that time. From time to time, he'd write an article for the Welsh Churchman. When the former Bishop of Llandaff, Eryl Thomas, had to resign, Gio wrote a very warm article about his work. Apart from one sentence, since he wrote it in English, I'll repeat it in English, because after all these years, I've remembered it word for word. There is no room in the midst of the church for anyone who cannot or will not desist from homosexual practices. As editor, I tried to persuade him to do away with that sentence. No, the answer came, the Pentas pilot's word, what I have written, I have written. It shows, of course, the official attitude of the Church in Wales towards homosexuality, but also his stance that he was not going to accept any change in what he had written. Despite that, he offered me a post as Director of Education in the diocese following Alwyn Rice-Jones, a post which I did not accept. And after that, he came back to me to offer a post as Warden of Church Hostel, which I did accept in 1977. Years afterwards, after his retirement, he lived next door to me in the Criceth rectory, and I was his neighbour for 4 years until his death in 1990. And of course, I became to know him much better, since he was very anxious to take services in the parish church in Criceth. I organised his requiem after he told me exactly what was needed and what he wanted. Gio was born in London in 1913, the youngest of two brothers. Jack was the eldest. His father was a buyer in Dickens and Jones in Regent Street. They'd moved to London to look for work. His father was from Anglesey, his mother from Llanmor near Pwllheli. They were Welsh speakers and attended the Calvinistic Methodist Church in London and lived in East Finchley. But when he went to school there, he was sent home since he couldn't speak English at all. It's important that he got a first-class degree in English from Oxford later, but when he was 8 years old, the family moved to Penis Arwain, to a terrace house, a village between Carnarvon and Llanberis. In 1995, a plaque was placed on the house, and I remember reading the procession to the village as Bishop of Bangor then. His father opened a shop, and Gio and his brother went to school, Tanacoid. Of course, then he had a very English accent, which he very quickly lost. And in Welsh, his accent was very North Welsh. And his decision as a boy to be a minister with the Presbyterians, he went from primary school to Ysgol Bryn Refael in 1924. That was a small school with about 200 pupils, with about 9 or 10 teachers. And the medium of the school was English, although all the pupils came from Welsh-speaking homes. He won scholarship to Jesus College, Cambridge, to read English. He was a member of the Presbyterian Church in Oxford, and his intention was still to be a minister with the Presbyterians. And this is why, after graduating first class in English, he decided to pursue a degree in theology, in which he obtained a first class degree in 1925. In 1971, he was elected to be an honorary fellow of Jesus College, and of which he was very proud. But in 1935, he went to Harden's Library to study, and in 1936 he joined the Church in Wales and was confirmed by the Bishop of St Asaph, Bishop Harbert then. But he never forgot his chapel upbringing, and that explains, I think, a great deal of his ecumenical work, indeed, which was pioneering work later on in his career. Because usually when people turn from the chapel to church, they tend to the Anglo-Catholic and also tend to dismiss their chapel upbringing. For instance, Edwin Morris. Geo didn't do that, never did that. He praised his upbringing and sought, as we shall see, to find a meeting between the churches. He went from Harden to St. Stephen's House in Oxford, and the influence there was, of course, the instance of Glyn Simon, who was at the time warden of Church Hostel, and he was also the warden of Ordinands, as he was called then, in the two northern dioceses. And it was only for 1 year that Geo was at St. Stephen's House. Quite enough, he told me once. It was his description was rather boring. He was ordained by Bishop Havard, Bishop of St. Asaph, in 1937, and went as a curate to Denbigh, and was only there until 1940, when he went to teach New Testament and chaplain at St. David College, Lampeter, and then in 1940 he married Megan, and they had a son, Fabian, in 1944. In 1945, he was appointed warden of the Church Hostel in Bangor, and he was a lecturer at the university, chaplain for the St. Mary's College, and was responsible for teacher training, and also warden of Ordinands in both dioceses, the northern diocese, Asaph and Bangor, and was made canon in Bangor in 1948. But in the same year, when he was 35 years old, he was appointed as a principal of Llandovery College. And the school was established the necessity to foster the Welsh language and the history of Wales, the need to the sciences to be taught, and also for the school to foster the Christian faith. In 1957, he was elected as Bishop of Bangor, and there he remained until his retirement, combining the post of Archbishop of Wales from 1971 onwards. The Diocese of Bangor today, as in the past, extends from Anglesey to Llangurig, 100 miles from Holyhead. There is no huge town, no, in the period of Geo. The large towns were Carnarvon, Llandudno, half of Llandudno, the rest was in St. Asaph, a population of about 10 to 15,000 in these towns. A fairly poor diocese. Tourism was important, and many summer or second homes. And in that period also, it wasn't easy to drive from one end of the diocese to the other, because the roads weren't all that good. Even during my period as warden of Church Hostel in the 70s, before the A55 was constructed, you could spend an hour and a half to go from Bangor to Llandudno. I always remember in the Diocese of Bangor was large in geography, but with sparse population, and the southern part felt very remote from Bangor, and some of the mid Wales parishes were closer to the Diocese of Brecon than to the cathedral at Bangor. There were only about 200,000 people, even in the 90s, lived in the diocese, and many young people had left for the south because there was no work for them in the diocese. In addition, of course, to being Bishop of Bangor, he had to attend meetings in Cardiff fairly often. And because of that, the general opinion in the diocese was that this had killed his predecessor, J.C. Jones, at only 55 years of age. And indeed, there were periods from 1975 onwards when Gio was often ill. And of course, he had the responsibility not only for the diocese, but as Archbishop for 11 years for the whole province, and with all the duties that that entailed in the worldwide Anglican Communion. So what can we say about his work and his leadership as a bishop, firstly? 25 years in any post, particularly as a bishop in one diocese, requires much of any person. It asks for energy, freshness, and it requires vision. And Gio had a vision, and he was very much ahead of his time, bringing new ideas to the diocese. He, for instance, was the first to see the need for larger parishes than the ordinary parishes in the diocese, what we now call ministry areas. In 1966, he established a commission for the reorganization of the pastoral work of the diocese. The group suggested that some parishes should be combined, creating a team of people to work in different places. Although some of the ideas were not implemented, this commission was a help in the end in establishing rectoral benefices in the Diocese of Bangor, the first diocese to do so. In his report, the commission said that the diocese didn't have enough young candidates, no resources for lay ministry, and too many churches. But it must be remembered at the same time that the Diocese of Bangor had built 4 new churches, 2 in Bangor, Penrhos Garnedd on Maes Gylchen, and Morawelon in Holyhead. The final report was published in 1974, Facing the Future Together, by Christopher Harris of Swansea University. And the opinion was, rather than reading circumstances to decide the future, that proactive steps should be taken straight away. No other diocese in Wales or even England had commissioned such a review. The sadness is that 2/3 of the parishes hadn't taken part in the review at all. But at least, as I said, this did create rectoral benefices in places such as Carnarvon, Holyhead, Llandudno, Dolgellau and Barmouth. And the intention was to have several responsible. The parishes include a considerable town and more rural areas, which normally would have their own parish priest. For instance, the Dolgellau parish included the rural parishes around, such as Brythdir, Llanelltid and Llanfachredd. Gio saw that having priests in small rural parishes could create a sense of loneliness. They could support each other by bringing them together. The intention also to have priests for the whole areas to specialize, for instance, in youth work or school work. This wasn't just a matter of a scarcity of people offering themselves for the ministry, but to have people to cooperate and to help people to see that there wasn't enough work for a parson where only about 500 people lived in the parish. This was a new way of operating in new ways. And he didn't forget the lay people either. He believed that the missionary work of spreading the gospel belonged to all the people of God. The work of the priest ought to enable this to happen. I remember he astounded some people he was going to ordain in 1980 when he told them, don't forget that the most important sacrament is baptism, not ordination. And of course, he had a first class degree, so he knew what he was talking about. He also was the first to see the importance of stewardship. He told the diocese that the people of Africa gave 10 times more to the church than people in his diocese. Not just in money. And he established a stewardship committee. Normally, in February, he'd take a holiday, but would combine this with a visit to a part of the Anglican Communion, particularly after his appointment as Archbishop, in order to see what was happening in other dioceses and provinces and what would benefit the Diocese of Bangor. Despite all this, he was never seen to be downhearted, and he continued to see signs of faith and hope in parishes where others perhaps had despaired. Therefore, he inspired the diocese. His faith was firm, and he could see that God was always at work and could turn the most despairing situations into new life. He said once in the diocese, if Gio saw St. Cobbs, what he'd say was, look, there are signs of life. He never lost hope. He was always full of hope, and he could see his role as bishop as a promoter and facilitator. So he was a pioneer and an experimenter, and therefore it was much easier for his successors as bishops of Bangor to experiment and to do new things, because Gio had prepared the way for new ways of working and doing things. As I said, he was the first bishop to think of teams of priests and lay people to work together. He also was the first bishop in Wales to ordain people to the self-supporting ministry. So in 1967, he ordained people to work in the parishes of Llandudno and Edern and Tidweiliog in the Llyn Peninsula. During the Advent in 1970, there were 4 deacons, were all self-supporting. It was not until 1975 that the governing body laid down guidelines for the training of such clerics. It was Gio's vision here was that it would help a full-time priest with many churches and services, but also could serve in the places where they worked. As he wrote, they are not peripatetic fillers of gaps, but good conciliaries to their parish priests. And also, he had a scheme to train these people. It's worth remembering also that Gio had come to the decision by the 70s that women should be ordained to the ministry. But he didn't want to rush this. He saw the difficulties as well, people against the idea, and also the difficulty of moving before other provinces in the Anglican Communion. In the 70s, women were not ordained in the majority of provinces. But what had caused Geo to change his mind, I think, was a report of the Doctrinal Commission in 1972 through baptism. Women as well as men were part of the new creation in Christ Jesus. If so, they, through baptism, were sons and daughters of God, with no discrimination and difference. Why not, therefore, would they not be called to the ordained ministry? Because he believed, as he said, that baptism was more important than ordination. In 1975, the governing body moved, passed a resolution that there was no reason why women should not be ordained. Shouldn't the church take the first step? And indeed, the church in Wales did take the first step. To Geo, it was important that there should be consensus in the Anglican communion, the worldwide. The first deacon was ordained, Dr. Margaret Thrall, a lecturer in his last ordination in June 1980. She became to work with myself in the Anglican chaplaincy, and I had the privilege of ordaining her to the ministry in 1997. Despite the fact that he hadn't been a parish priest, only a curate in Denbigh, Geo sought to visit regularly his parishes, and he sympathised with some of their problems of rural areas, not many people, scarce resources, and so on. He could be pastoral when people were in crisis, and he established visits to all deaneries every 3 years. He was concerned at the fact that many of the parishes didn't pay expenses for their clerics so that they could operate effectively. He insisted that parishes could pay expenses before he made appointments, and he also believed that the ministers' salaries was too low and they needed to catch up with inflation. He wanted to see salaries similar to that of teachers. As far as the retirement of priests was concerned, Bangor was the first diocese to establish a housing association. Because of tremendous inflation of the 70s, when they became to retire, many of priests could afford to buy houses. Money was therefore collected to buy houses for rent to priests who needed this after they retired. He gave an example of the problem. In 1973, a two-bedroom bungalow in Meirionydd cost £12,000. The sum that a priest could receive after 40 years in the priesthood was less than 2,000. He also was concerned about the widows of priests. Until 1966, widows didn't receive any pension at all. And when this was changed, it was only those who'd been priests widowed after 1966 would receive pensions. This was all changed in 1973 when he was Archbishop. Therefore, as a bishop, he was pastoral, although, of course, he did have a tendency to behave rather like a headmaster towards his priests. But in time, this softened. He was also always willing to experiment and took his pastoral responsibilities very seriously. What, therefore, about his work as an archbishop for 11 years? I'm going to concentrate on 4 themes. His work as chair of committees, for the translation of the Bible into contemporary Welsh. Secondly, his attempt to bring all the churches of Wales of all denominations together and, apart from the Church of Rome, to form one church. Thirdly, his vision that we needed to look anew at the Diocese of Wales and also the post of Archbishop And fourthly, his attitude towards the Welsh language and his contribution to the life of Wales generally. The first point, his work as chair of the Committee for the Translation of the Bible. He was the chair in 1961 onwards, under the sponsorship of the Council for Churches. All denominations of church, including the Church of Rome, were part of this enterprise. The first time that the Church of Rome in any part of the world became a member of such an enterprise. There was a translation panel for both testaments, with another panel looking in detail at the consistency of language and style. And as chairman of the supervisory committee, this took a great deal of his time. There was a service to celebrate the translation of the New Testament in 1975, when he preached on the principles of the New Testament: grace, charity, and faith, and the willingness of the church to serve the community, and how important with these features was for the whole of Wales. In 2 years, 100,000 copies of the Testament had been sold, and you must remember that sales of Welsh books were quite low in this time. In 1979, the Psalms were translated, and 400 years in 1988, after William Morgan's translation, the entire Bible had been translated into contemporary Welsh. And Gio was the preacher in Westminster Abbey to celebrate all this. He made an appeal during the sermon for people to look anew at the place of the Welsh language in the nation's life, and the call for a new language act. There was no language act at the time. At the same time, he was a member of the committee which was responsible for the new English Bible, the NEB. So he played a considerable part in supervising this enterprise of translating the Welsh language, the Bible into the Welsh language. Secondly, he was fervently in favor of ecumenism. His starting point, as always, was theological. We are all ready to follow, to be one in Christ Jesus. We don't need to argue about this. What was needed was to realize this in the life of Wales through uniting all churches under the same umbrella. And the way of doing that was for the churches to covenant together and in the end to form one visible church in order to serve the whole of Wales, and also to serve more effectively. As I said at the beginning of the talk, rather than making him an opponent of the nonconformist, he saw the importance of church unity. Although he believed that the church in Wales was a Catholic and Apostolic church, he didn't believe, as many people who were Anglo-Catholics, that other churches were not part of one Church of God, belonging to the body of Christ. And it must be borne in mind that ecumenism wasn't very important to his predecessors, Glyn Simon and Edwin Morris. Morris believed that all chapels should come back to the mother church. I remember Gio and his upbringing in the Methodist Church. Different denominations caused hurt to God and also affected their mission. The church isn't a club, but a family with Jesus as the head. He was a member of the faith section of the Council of Churches for Britain, and he go to the World Council of Churches meetings. That is why he gave his energy to the covenant for unity. Churches covenanting together to work together for future unity. So the covenanting committee was established with Geo chairing. And in addition to the church in Wales, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, and some of the Baptist churches were part of this covenant. And this committee proceeded to form what all the churches had in common, insofar as faith, mission, and membership was, and procedure was concerned. Principles of unity. The intention was to crystallize this. He already believed before moving on to see how it was possible to create one church for Wales. In the stumbling block, of course, was the ministry and the need for ministers to be ordained by a bishop. Some, of course, didn't even believe that other churches were real churches. But as Geo said, if the churches baptize in the faith of Christ, preach the gospel, and celebrate communion, and call and teach the faith, the apostolic faith, and foster community, of course they are churches, because God works through them. The covenant was launched in 1975, but, of course, ultimately, the main stumbling block was ordination by a bishop, and unfortunately, in the end, none of the churches accepted this ecumenical enterprise, despite all Geo's attempts. The third point was Geo was a Welshman and saw the language and culture and religion of Wales as very important features. He saw the language as being all important in a country where people had fostered their relationship with themselves and with God through the medium of the language. He saw the language, however, as an important feature, not just to those who spoke it, but for everyone in Wales. But he also knew that the majority of people living in Wales could speak the language. He was therefore anxious that the church in Wales should be a bilingual church, and that both languages would be respected, and that people who spoke both languages would respect each other, and both languages would be used in worship, church meetings, and any statement put out by the province. At the beginning of his work as a bishop, he only ordained people who could speak the language, but he changed his mind about this. So his wish was for a bilingual Wales, one country with two languages. He wasn't willing that he wasn't in favor of law-breaking and burning of summer houses. He wanted reasoning and argument, and it was because of Geo, I think, the church in Wales became totally bilingual. And also because of his influence with Lord Cledwyn and Goronwy Daniel, went as a deputation to the Deputy Prime Minister, William Whiteley, got the government to change their minds about a Welsh TV channel, SBC for Wales, rather than splitting Wales between BBC and ITV. He was therefore a firm and moderate leader in Wales, seeing all sides of an argument, but was against violence. His voice, I think, was an important voice in that period. And fourthly, Chris Harris, who'd been responsible for the report on the future of diocese, got him to do the same thing insofar as the province was concerned. I won't go into detail, but the truth is that the change hadn't happened insofar as the other diocese was concerned since disestablishment, and soon afterwards new dioceses, Monmouth and Swansea and Brecon, were created. The vision of the commission was to create a new diocese in mid Wales by taking parts of St Asaph, Bangor, and Swansea and Brecon, This would be the Archbishop's diocese. This would link the Swansea and Brecon, and Bangor and St Asaph would be one diocese, but with two bishops working together. Once again, the ideas were too radical for the governing body. And as the documents, this was also buried, unfortunately. On the surface, therefore, his attempts as regards ecumenism and reorganisation of the Diocese of Wales were failures. The truth is, of course, that the Church in Wales, sooner or later, will have to return to these burning issues. Restructuring is needed, and ultimately we need to decide on the location of the Archbishop. George Noakes was Archbishop from St David's, and even Glyn Simon recognised that this needed to be sorted. 5 commissions later, nothing has changed. And the same thing is true of the covenant. Sooner or later, the three churches and the Church in Wales will have to come together. It's a disgrace, indeed, that we all minister separately, because the numbers are reducing, and our mission, therefore, is less effective, because we do not work together. Gio, as bishop and archbishop, saw this clearly, and he argues for both points. It's more important for strong theological reasons for this, as you would expect for somebody who had a degree in theology. In future, the Church in Wales will realise how fundamental his period as Archbishop was, and how creative his vision was for the future, not just of the Church in Wales, but all of the churches of Wales, and as for Wales as a nation. This is a true legacy, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bishop Barry, for that presentation on the work of Gio Williams. I got the impression, particularly in his work as Archbishop, that he was a man ahead of his time. Oh, he was. Yes, undoubtedly. And these subjects, as you said, they will need to be revisited at some point. Therefore, someday, perhaps his vision will come to fruition, although it was... yes, of course. He was a pioneer in Bangor as well, because to me the work of the Bishop of Bangor was much easier because the diocese was familiar with experimentation, because he went to different dioceses and provinces and came back with these ideas. A covenant, for instance, he discovered in South India and North India, and thought, well, this was important, that Wales would also, for the churches of Wales. There is an opportunity to ask a question before we bring the formal session to an end. So if anybody has a question or a comment, this is your opportunity. I can't see any. Oh, Ainsley has his hand up. Ainsley? I'm sorry, I'm taking too much time. But if does anybody else want to ask a question, or I could leave this question until the informal chat session? Okay, you're the only one. Thank you, Bishop Barry. That was masterful. Thank you. The comment I have is, it appears to me that Gio considered baptism as central to the Christian life, as it should be, of course. The sacrament is central to our Christian life. And when you talk about his relationship with the other denominations, and also questions about ordination, and baptism is central, and we rejoice in that. It's a sadness to me, 50 years later, that the covenant has not come to fruition as Geo and his contemporaries had wished. I hesitate to say this with two bishops giving a presentation today. The Ministry of Bishops is often the stumbling block. And as this is true of the other Anglican churches, do you see a way of resolving this? It's not true. It's true that we are facing a crisis in the covenant after failing to solve this over decades. Well, the churches did, covenanting churches produced a way, I think, of creating an ecumenical bishop in Wales. And if that had proceeded, it would be possible, I think, to solve. Okay. Perhaps we wouldn't want to reordain people who had been already ordained. And perhaps you might just have to agree that there is inconsistency here. But it's not true, of course. If we are totally honest, we talk about the apostolic succession. It's not true that everyone who's ordained goes back to the first apostles. So I don't see that you couldn't accept the fact that there will be gaps. But ultimately, in order for the benefit of the gospel and for Wales, and you go back to what you talked about, Ainsley, about secular, and of course there are so many people who don't attend any place of worship and the numbers are going down. It doesn't make any sense. I remember Colin Morris saying, churches talk about their unity. From a bald-headed man. But would you buy a hair restorer from a bald-headed man? I mean, that goes to the root of the problem, I think. Excellent. I think that's a very memorable image, and I'll remember that. Thank you. Gethin Rhys has a question.
Yeah, just
yes, just going on the question from Ainsley. It's possible for us to be very pessimistic for the reasons you've outlined. But we shouldn't underestimate how different the atmosphere is between the non-conform churches and the church in Wales compared with 50 years as regards cooperation. Everything apart from ordination at the grassroots and nationally. I think the atmosphere has changed. We shouldn't underestimate, and it's obvious from what you've said, Barry. Am I right in thinking that the important decision of the Church in Wales some years ago to accept the communion all who had been baptized, according to Geo's vision, obviously, that is something I find myself having to explain to nonconformists. Of course, I went to the parish church, but I couldn't take communion. Well, I have to say, well, actually, you could. Things have changed, haven't they? And I think we don't place enough value on the things that have happened, and rather than turning around the question of ordination, which is difficult, I understand. That we should be celebrating those elements which are possible, and that our forefathers 50 years ago wouldn't have thought it was impossible. Yes, you're right. That is quite true. We mustn't forget that, because Edwin Morris, for instance, said, come back to the mother. This attitude, luckily, has disappeared, and we all realize that we have to work together. There we are. It's gone 11:30, and therefore, may I, one comment has come up in the chat from Winifred Davis, thanking for the two interesting and revealing talks. Gio confirmed me and have good memories of him. May I therefore thank all of you for being present this morning in the formal session. After the formal session is finished, you're welcome to stay for a more informal chat until midday. But mainly, can I thank the two speakers, Bishop Rowan and Bishop Barry, for introducing to us and to somebody who knows who knows the names, Gio Williams and Glyn Simon. They were only names, but to flesh out the bones, so to speak, and their valuable contributions to the church in Wales. And also perhaps they've both planted seeds which are yet to come to fruition in our life as a church in Wales. Thank you very much, Rowan and Barry. So I terminate the formal meeting. To those who wish to stay, you're welcome to do so for a more informal chat. Thank you very much.